I don't care who you are, man. Step back. Now.
Easy, son. You don't know what you're pointing at.
You just killed a soldier. The words didn't come out loud at first, they sat heavy in the air like something the wind refused to carry away, and for a moment the entire street seemed to hold its breath as the flashing red and blue lights reflected off the quiet suburban pavement, off the windows of parked cars, off the still form lying just a few feet from the front bumper of the police cruiser, its engine idling with a low mechanical hum that felt far too alive for what had just happened. Arthur Hayes didn't move right away. He stood there with his hand still loosely wrapped around the worn leather leash, the other end now empty, the metal clip swaying slightly as if it hadn't yet realized it had nothing left to hold on to, and then slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself down, one knee touching the asphalt, then the other, as if he had done this before, as if his body remembered something his mind refused to revisit, his hand reaching forward, not shaking, not rushing, just steady, resting gently against the thick golden fur that no longer responded, his thumb brushing once along the collar where the name Buddy was engraved in faded letters, the same collar he had buckled every morning for the past 6 years without fail. Around him, doors opened, voices murmured, a phone camera lifted somewhere across the street, but Arthur didn't look up, didn't acknowledge any of it. His world had narrowed to a single point on the ground. And in that silence, the sharp click of a car door breaking open sounded louder than it should have. Police Chief Daniel Brooks stepped out with the kind of confidence that came from years of being obeyed without question, adjusting his sunglasses, scanning the scene not with concern but with irritation, his boots crunching lightly against gravel as he approached, stopping just short of Arthur, glancing down briefly before exhaling as if inconvenienced. "Sir, you need to move that animal," he said, his tone flat, procedural, already turning slightly as if the matter had been handled the moment he spoke. "You're obstructing an active operation," and for a second, just a second, the words didn't seem to land, not because Arthur didn't hear them, but because they didn't belong in the same reality as the moment unfolding on that street. Arthur's hand paused on the collar, his fingers pressing slightly against the engraved metal, and something in his posture shifted, not outwardly, not in a way most people would notice, but enough that a younger officer standing near the cruiser, Officer Ryan Cole, felt it immediately. A quiet tightening in the air, like pressure before a storm you couldn't yet see. Arthur finally lifted his eyes, not to the flashing lights, not to the gathering crowd, but directly to Brooks, his expression unreadable, calm in a way that didn't ask for sympathy and didn't accept dismissal either, and when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, and carried further than it should have. "You didn't see him, did you?" It wasn't a question, not really. And Brooks let out a short breath through his nose, already impatient, already dismissing. "I saw enough," he replied, his jaw tightening slightly. "Now I suggest you step aside before this becomes something else." And somewhere behind him, Officer Cole swallowed, his eyes flicking from the old man to the collar, to the way Arthur still hadn't let go, to the silence that seemed to grow heavier instead of breaking, and for the first time since the cruiser had stopped, something about the situation didn't feel routine anymore. The silence did not break after Brooks spoke, it thickened, settling into the space between them like something unseen but undeniable, and Arthur Hayes slowly rose to his feet with the same measured control he had shown when he knelt, his hand still holding the leash, the empty clip now still against his palm, while the other remained close to Buddy's collar for just a moment longer before lifting away as if leaving something behind required permission he was not ready to give. Brooks shifted his weight, glancing briefly toward the flashing lights of his cruiser and then back at the growing cluster of onlookers, clearly more concerned with the disruption than the man in front of him. "Sir, I am not going to repeat myself," he said, his voice firmer now, edged with authority that expected compliance. "Step away so we can clear the scene." But Arthur did not step back, did not raise his voice, did not argue. He simply stood there, shoulders squared but relaxed, his gaze steady and level. The kind of stillness that did not challenge yet refused to yield. Across the street, a phone camera tilted slightly to keep both men in frame, capturing the contrast without understanding it, while Officer Ryan Cole took a slow step closer, his eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in recognition of something he could not yet name, something about the way Arthur held himself, the way he absorbed the tension without reacting to it, like a man who had long ago learned that noise did not equal power. Brooks exhaled sharply and took another step forward, closing the distance. "You are Interfering with an active police response, he said, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel more like a warning than a statement. I can cite you right now if you continue. And there it was, the shift from procedure to pressure, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that usually ended conversations quickly. But Arthur did not look at the badge, did not look at the cruiser. His eyes remained fixed on Brooks as if those symbols carried no weight here. A faint breeze moved through the street, brushing against the edge of Arthur's jacket, and for a brief second his fingers tightened around the leash, not in anger, but in memory. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that same quiet weight. He stayed closer than most men ever did, he said, almost to himself, but loud enough to be heard. And Brooks frowned, irritation flickering across his face. I am not here for stories, he replied, gesturing vaguely toward Buddy without looking directly at him. I am here to do my job. And somewhere behind him, Cole felt that same tightening again, stronger now, his gaze dropping to the collar, to the faint engraving that caught the light just enough to be read if you looked closely. Buddy, K9 Unit 3, the word simple but out of place in a quiet neighborhood like this, and Cole's brow furrowed as pieces began to shift in his mind, incomplete but pressing. Arthur followed his line of sight for a fraction of a second, then back to Brooks, and there was no anger in his expression. No accusation, only a calm that made everything around it feel louder, more unstable. You think this is just a dog, Arthur said, his tone even, not challenging, not pleading, just stating something Brooks had already decided, and Brooks let out a short, dismissive breath, shaking his head slightly. As if the conversation had gone on too long. I think this is over, he said, turning his shoulder slightly, already signaling the end of it. Move, or I will have you moved. And for the first time, Cole spoke, his voice careful, controlled. Chief, you might want to take a look at that collar, he said, not stepping forward, not interrupting, just placing the words into the space between them. And Brooks paused, just for a second, not out of concern, but out of irritation at being questioned. His eyes flicking briefly toward Cole, then down, and in that brief glance, something small shifted, not understanding, not yet, but enough to slow the moment, enough to break the rhythm he had been controlling. And Arthur saw it, not as an advantage, not as a victory, but as the first sign that the situation no longer belonged entirely to the man in uniform. Brooks's eyes lingered on the collar for a fraction longer than before, just enough for the engraved words to register without fully settling into meaning, and he straightened almost immediately, as if rejecting whatever thought tried to surface, his jaw tightening as he looked back at Arthur with renewed impatience. It does not change anything, he said, his tone sharper now, less controlled. The kind of edge that comes when authority feels questioned rather than obeyed. You are still obstructing an active situation, and he gestured again toward the cruiser, toward the road, toward anything that reinforced his position. But the rhythm was gone now, the smooth certainty replaced by something uneven. Arthur did not respond right away, his gaze drifting briefly past Brooks, not to the crowd, not to the flashing lights, but somewhere further, somewhere older, and for a moment the present seemed to loosen its hold on him. The quiet suburban street fading beneath a different kind of silence, one that carried heat instead of cool air, one that hummed with distant machinery and tension stretched across open ground. And in that fleeting space, the leash in his hand did not feel empty, it felt like weight, like presence, like a constant at his side that had never once broken formation. The memory did not arrive loudly, it did not overwhelm, it slipped in through a detail, the collar, the lettering, the exact way the metal caught the light, and suddenly the street was replaced by dust and sunlight reflecting off something far less forgiving. A voice over a radio, strained but steady. Hayes, do not move, you are not alone. And the pressure of a body close to his leg, steady, alert, unwavering, a presence that did not hesitate when everything else did. The image passed as quickly as it came, leaving only the echo of it behind, and Arthur's eyes returned to Brooks, clear, focused, present again, but carrying something that had not been there before. Not anger, not grief alone, but recognition of a line that had already been crossed. You do not understand what you are standing on, Arthur said quietly, the words measured, each one placed with intention rather than force, and Brooks let out a short laugh that did not reach his eyes, stepping closer again, reclaiming distance as if proximity itself could restore control. I understand exactly what this is, he replied, his voice low, deliberate, and I am telling you to step aside. But even as he spoke, Officer Cole had moved another half step forward, not enough to challenge, just enough to see more clearly, his gaze fixed on Arthur now, on the way the older man's posture had not changed under pressure, on the way his voice did not rise, did not crack, did not rush, and something in Cole's chest tightened with the realization that this was not defiance, this was something else entirely, something practiced, something earned. "Chief," Cole said again, more firmly this time, though still controlled, "that marking. K9 Unit 3, that is not civilian," and Brooks turned his head sharply, irritation flaring. "I know what it says," he snapped, though his tone carried less certainty than before. "It does not matter," but the words landed differently now, thinner, less grounded, and Arthur watched the exchange without interrupting, without shifting, his silence no longer passive but deliberate, as if allowing the moment to unfold was part of something larger. The distant hum of another engine began to creep into the edge of the scene, faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the cruiser, but growing, steady, purposeful, and though no one had yet turned toward it, Arthur's grip on the leash eased slightly, not in relief, but in acknowledgement, as if something set in motion long before this moment had finally reached the point where it could no longer be ignored. The sound grew louder, no longer something that could be mistaken for background noise, a low, controlled engine approaching at a steady pace that did not match the urgency of the flashing lights already dominating the street, and one by one, heads began to turn, not because they were told to, but because something in that sound carried weight, purpose, the kind that did not rush and did not need to announce itself. Brooks noticed at last. His focus still locked on Arthur, still trying to reassert control over a situation that had begun to slip through his fingers in ways he could not yet explain. "This is your final warning," he said, his voice tightening, sharper now, but lacking the earlier confidence. "Step back and let us do our job," and Arthur simply stood there, the leash resting in his hand, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady, not challenging, not defiant, just present in a way that made everything around him feel temporary. The approaching vehicle came into view at the far end of the street, dark, unmarked, moving with a deliberate calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the scene it was entering, and as it rolled closer, the subtle shift in atmosphere became undeniable. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, phones lowered slightly, even the flashing lights from the cruiser seemed less dominant, as if something quieter had taken control of the space. Officer Cole felt it immediately, his attention snapping toward the vehicle, his instincts recognizing something his training had only hinted at, and he took a small step back without realizing it, his earlier uncertainty now sharpening into something closer to understanding. While Brooks finally turned, his expression hardening as he watched the vehicle come to a smooth stop just short of the scene, his jaw setting as if preparing for another interruption he intended to handle the same way as the first. The engine cut off, and for a brief second, there was nothing, no movement, no voices, just a stillness that stretched across the street like a held breath, and then the driver's side door opened with a quiet, deliberate motion, not rushed, not dramatic, just controlled, and a man stepped out in a pressed uniform that carried no need for introduction, his presence alone enough to shift the balance of the moment, his posture straight, his gaze already fixed ahead as if he had arrived knowing exactly where to look. Arthur did not turn to greet him, did not step forward, did not signal in any way, but something in his stance acknowledged the arrival without needing to see it, while Brooks squared his shoulders, adjusting his stance as if preparing to assert authority once more, though the movement felt smaller now, less certain. "This is a restricted scene," Brooks called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "Firm but no longer absolute, you will need to identify yourself," and the man did not respond immediately. He simply walked forward at a measured pace, each step unhurried, each movement precise, closing the distance without looking at anyone else, not at the cruiser, not at the crowd, not even at Brooks, his attention fixed on a single point. Officer Cole's breath caught slightly as recognition settled in, not from a name, not from a memory, but from the unmistakable shift in how the moment itself was unfolding, and he straightened instinctively, his posture aligning before his mind fully caught up, while Brooks took a half step forward, ready to intercept, ready to re-establish control. But the man in uniform did not slow, did not acknowledge the attempt. He simply continued until he stood a few feet from Arthur Hayes, and then, without a word, without hesitation, he raised his hand in a crisp, unmistakable salute, the gesture clean, precise, and absolute, and in that instant, the entire street seemed to freeze, not from command, not from fear, but from the sudden, undeniable realization that everything that had come before no longer held the same weight. The salute did not break the silence, it deepened it, locking every movement in place as if the air itself had been pulled tight across the street, and for a moment no one seemed to remember how to react, not the bystanders, not the officers, not even Brooks, who stood there with his authority still half raised in his posture but no longer supported by the moment around him. The man in uniform held the salute with absolute precision, his eyes fixed on Arthur Hayes, not as a formality, not as a courtesy, but as recognition, the kind that carried history within it, and Arthur, after a brief pause, returned it, not sharply, not ceremonially, but with a quiet steadiness that matched everything about him, his hand rising and falling with the same controlled weight that had defined every movement since the moment began. Only then did the man lower his hand and take a single step closer, his voice calm, low, but carrying across the space without effort. "Staff Sergeant Arthur Hayes," he said, not asking, not confirming, simply stating a fact that needed no validation. "It has been a long time," and Arthur gave a small nod, his expression unchanged. "Long enough," he replied, his tone even, as if the years between them were something measured but not dwelled on. Behind them, Officer Cole straightened instinctively, his earlier uncertainty replaced by a sharp awareness, his eyes moving quickly between the two men as the weight of what he was witnessing began to settle into something real, something far beyond routine, while Brooks remained where he stood, his stance rigid, his jaw tight, trying to process a situation that had shifted without his control, his voice finally cutting back into the scene. Though now lacking the edge it once carried, "Sir, this is a police matter," he said, stepping forward slightly. "I need to know your business here," but the man in uniform did not turn immediately, did not acknowledge the interruption, his attention still on Arthur for a fraction longer before he shifted his gaze, slow and deliberate, toward Brooks, and in that look alone something changed, not loudly, not aggressively, but unmistakably. "My business," the man said calmly, "is already here." And he let the words settle before continuing. "General Marcus Whitaker, United States Marine Corps," he added, not raising his voice, not emphasizing the rank, because he did not need to, the title carrying its own weight into the space between them. Brooks blinked once, the name landing harder than expected, his posture adjusting almost imperceptibly as his mind raced to reconcile the situation. But pride held him in place. "With all due respect, General," he began, the words careful but strained, "this is still under my jurisdiction," and for a brief second, the old rhythm tried to return, the assertion of control, the reliance on position, but it faltered before it could take hold. Whitaker's expression did not change, his gaze steady, not confrontational, not dismissive, simply fixed, and yet, he replied, his tone even, "You are standing over a retired Marine and his partner." He paused just long enough for the word to settle, not dog, not animal, but partner, and the distinction carried weight that could not be ignored. "A K-9 who served under military command," he continued, his voice still calm, "and you chose to treat this as an inconvenience," and the street remained silent, every word landing clean, unchallenged, while Brooks's shoulders stiffened, the certainty he had relied on now fractured by something he could not easily dismiss. And Arthur stood between them, unmoving, silent, not needing to speak. Because for the first time since the moment began, he did not have to. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and final, pressing into the space where Brooks had stood unquestioned just moments before, and for the first time since he stepped out of his cruiser, he did not immediately respond, his mouth opening slightly as if to speak, then closing again as the weight of General Whitaker's presence reshaped the ground beneath him in a way he could not control. The flashing lights behind him continued their steady rhythm, but they felt distant now. Disconnected from the moment unfolding at the center of the street, where authority had quietly shifted without a single raised voice, Brooks adjusted his stance, squaring his shoulders again, attempting to regain footing. "General, with respect," he began, his tone measured but tighter than before, "this situation is still under civil jurisdiction," and though the words were correct, technically sound, they lacked the force they had carried earlier, as if something essential had been stripped away. Whitaker did not move closer, did not raise his voice, he simply held his position, his gaze steady. "Jurisdiction does not erase responsibility," he said calmly, each word placed with precision, "and it certainly does not excuse conduct," and there was no accusation in his tone, no escalation, just a statement that left no room for interpretation. Arthur remained silent, his hands still holding the leash. His posture unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in him now, not relief, not satisfaction, but the quiet recognition that the moment no longer depended on him to carry it forward. Officer Cole exhaled slowly, his earlier uncertainty replaced by a clear understanding of the line that had been crossed, his eyes moving briefly to Brooks, then back to Whitaker, as if recalibrating where authority truly stood. Brooks glanced around, as if searching for reinforcement, for something familiar to anchor himself to, but the crowd remained silent, no longer reacting to him, no longer waiting for his direction, and when he looked back at Whitaker, there was a fraction of hesitation that had not been there before. "Are you implying misconduct?" he asked, the question careful, controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of strain. Whitaker's expression remained unchanged. "I am stating that a retired Marine and a military working dog were treated with disregard," he replied, his tone even, "and that is now being addressed," and the clarity of it left no room for deflection. A second vehicle, also unmarked, rolled quietly to a stop behind Whitaker's, its arrival subtle but deliberate, and two individuals stepped out, their attire not immediately identifiable to the casual observer but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for, their presence adding weight to a situation that was already beyond Brooks's control. Officer Cole straightened further, instinctively stepping aside as they approached, his earlier role in the scene now replaced by something closer to observation, while Brooks remained where he stood, his options narrowing with each passing second, his earlier confidence now replaced by calculation. Whitaker finally shifted his gaze slightly, not away from Brooks, but enough to acknowledge the arrival behind him. "This will be reviewed," he said, his voice calm, "thoroughly and properly." And though the words were simple, they carried the kind of finality that did not require volume. Arthur's eyes moved briefly to the second vehicle, then back to Whitaker, and there was a quiet understanding there, unspoken but complete, a recognition of process, of structure, of a system that did not need to be forced because it already knew how to respond. Brooks inhaled slowly, the air feeling heavier now, his posture still upright but no longer commanding, and for the first time since the moment began, he did not issue an order, did not assert control, he simply stood there, caught in the realization that the situation had moved beyond him, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through something far more decisive, the quiet arrival of authority that did not need to prove itself because it had already been earned. The two individuals who stepped out of the second vehicle did not rush, did not announce themselves, they moved with the same measured control that had defined everything since General Whitaker arrived, their presence quiet but unmistakable, and as they approached, subtle details became clearer, the way they observed before speaking, the way their eyes moved across the scene, taking in positions, posture, sequence, not looking for noise, but for truth. Officer Ryan Cole instinctively stepped further aside, his body aligning with a structure he now recognized, one that did not need explanation, while Brooks remained fixed in place, his stance still upright but no longer anchored, his earlier certainty replaced by a careful stillness, as if any sudden move might make the situation worse. One of the men stopped a few feet from Whitaker, giving a brief nod of acknowledgement before shifting his attention toward Brooks, his voice calm, professional. "Chief Brooks," he said, not asking for confirmation, "we will need you to step back for a moment," and the phrasing was deliberate, not a command shouted across a scene, but something far more controlled, the kind of instruction that assumed compliance without demanding it. Brooks hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, his eyes flicking between Whitaker and the two men, calculating, weighing, but the space around him had already changed, the invisible line he once controlled now drawn somewhere else, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he took a step back, then another, his movement small but significant, the first time he had yielded ground since the moment began. Arthur watched without moving, his grip on the leash relaxed but present, his gaze steady, not focused on Brooks, not focused on the crowd, but on the unfolding process itself, as if he had seen this before, not in this place, not in this form, but in principle, in structure, in the quiet way systems corrected themselves when properly engaged. The second man crouched slightly near Buddy, not touching, not interfering, just observing, his eyes moving briefly to the collar, to the engraving, then back up toward Arthur with a nod that carried understanding without words, while the first man continued. "We will document everything as it stands," he said, his tone even, and we will coordinate with your department through the appropriate channels," and though the words were procedural, they carried weight, because they were no longer part of Brooks's control, they existed outside of it. Brooks cleared his throat, his voice lower now, more measured. "I am still responsible for this scene," he said, not as firmly as before, but still holding on to what remained. And the man nodded once, acknowledging the statement without conceding to it, "and that responsibility will be reviewed accordingly," he replied, leaving no space for argument, no escalation, just a quiet redirection that placed Brooks within the process rather than above it. The street remained silent, the earlier murmurs gone, replaced by a stillness that felt intentional, as if everyone present understood, even without knowing the details, that something important was unfolding, something that did not need volume or force to assert itself. Whitaker remained where he stood, his presence steady, not intervening further, because he did not need to. The system was already moving, already aligning, and Arthur Hayes stood at the center of it all, unchanged, unmoved, his silence no longer mistaken for weakness, but understood, finally, for what it had always been: control. Nothing moved quickly, and that was what made it unmistakable, the absence of urgency in a place that had started with flashing lights and raised voices, the way every action now carried intention instead of reaction. And as the two officials continued their quiet work, documenting, observing, aligning details without interference, the entire street seemed to settle into a new rhythm, one that no longer revolved around command but around correction. Brooks stood a few steps back from where he had first taken control, his hands resting near his belt, his posture still upright but no longer projecting dominance, his eyes tracking every movement now with a focus that had replaced certainty, as if he were trying to understand how quickly the ground had shifted beneath him without a single direct challenge. Officer Ryan Cole remained off to the side, his stance straight, his attention sharp, but there was something different in his expression now, not tension, not uncertainty, but clarity, the kind that comes when a line becomes visible that was not before. And he glanced briefly at Arthur Hayes, seeing not just an older man standing quietly in the street, but something else entirely, something earned, something that did not need explanation because it was carried in posture, in silence, in the way he had never once raised his voice. One of the officials rose from his crouched position near Buddy, stepping back with the same deliberate control, his gaze lifting to meet Arthur's for a moment, and in that brief exchange, there was acknowledgement, not of loss alone, but of service. Of history, of something that extended far beyond the boundaries of the street they stood on. General Whitaker remained steady, his presence unchanged, not directing, not intervening further, because the process had already taken hold, and his role had never been to dominate the moment, only to ensure it unfolded correctly. Brooks shifted again, his voice finally breaking the silence, but softer now, more measured. "What happens next?" he asked, the question no longer framed as a challenge, but as an attempt to regain footing within a structure that no longer centered around him. And one of the officials answered without hesitation, his tone calm, professional. "Next, everything is reviewed through the proper channels," he said, "including conduct, response, and procedure," and the words carried no threat, no accusation, just a clear path forward that did not require interpretation. Brooks nodded once, slowly, the movement small but meaningful, his earlier resistance replaced by a quiet acceptance that this was no longer his scene to control, and he took another step back, creating space where before he had taken it. Arthur did not move, his hands still holding the leash, his gaze steady, but there was a subtle shift in him now, not relief, not closure, but the quiet recognition that the moment had reached its turning point, that what needed to be set in motion had already begun. The flashing lights from the cruiser continued in the background, but they felt distant now. Secondary, as if they belonged to a different version of the scene, one that no longer existed, and the street, once tense and uncertain, now stood in a kind of quiet equilibrium, where no one spoke unless necessary, and nothing needed to be forced. And in that silence, the balance had fully shifted, not through confrontation, not through volume, but through the steady presence of something far stronger. Something that did not need to announce itself because it had already been recognized by everyone who stood there. The street did not return to what it had been before, it could not, something had shifted too deeply for that, and yet the tension that once filled it had dissolved into a quiet that felt earned rather than imposed, the kind that settles after something important has been acknowledged. The officials finished their work without haste, each note taken, each observation recorded with the same deliberate care that had defined their arrival, and when they stepped back, they did not announce completion, they simply nodded once toward General Whitaker, a silent confirmation that what needed to be set in motion had already begun beyond the view of the street. Whitaker turned his attention back to Arthur Hayes, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, and for a moment, neither man spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because words would have added nothing to what had already been understood. Between them, Arthur's gaze lowered briefly to the leash in his hand, the empty clip catching the light one last time, and his fingers closed gently around it, not as a grip, but as a quiet acknowledgement of what it had always represented. Then he looked back up, meeting Whitaker's eyes with the same calm he had carried from the beginning. "He did his job," Arthur said simply, his voice low, steady, not weighted by anger, not sharpened by loss, just a statement of truth that needed no embellishment. Whitaker gave a slight nod, the kind reserved for things that cannot be measured by rank or report. "He always did," he replied, and the words settled with the same quiet finality that had shaped everything since his arrival. A small movement came from the side as Officer Ryan Cole stepped forward, just enough to be seen, his posture straight, his voice respectful. "Sir," he said, addressing Arthur, not Whitaker. "If there is anything you need," he did not finish the sentence. Not because he did not know how, but because he understood that some offers do not require completion, and Arthur acknowledged him with a brief nod, a recognition of intent rather than necessity. Behind them, Brooks remained still, no longer at the center, no longer directing, his earlier presence reduced to something quieter, more reflective, his eyes moving once toward Arthur, then away, as if the moment had left him with something he could not easily resolve. The vehicles remained where they were, engines silent now, their presence no longer commanding but simply part of the scene, and the flashing lights from the cruiser, still active, felt almost out of place, a remnant of a different kind of authority that no longer defined what had happened here. Arthur took a single step forward, then another, not away from the scene, but through it, moving with the same measured control he had shown from the beginning, and as he passed Whitaker, there was no need for another word, no need for acknowledgement, because everything that needed to be said had already been understood. The crowd remained quiet, watching without speaking, not out of fear, but out of respect for something they had witnessed but might never fully comprehend, the way a moment can begin in conflict and end in something far heavier, far quieter. And as Arthur Hayes walked slowly down the street, the leash still in his hand, the space behind him did not fill with noise or reaction, it remained still, held in a silence that carried meaning far beyond the scene itself, a silence that did not demand attention, did not seek recognition, but lingered all the same, reminding everyone present that respect is not given by position, it is revealed by truth, and once revealed, it cannot be ignored.